Well, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Allan Hsiao, who is a new professor here in the Department of Economics and in the School of Public and International Affairs. And he is an environmental and developmental economist and someone that we welcome with open arms in C-PREE, since we've been hoping to see the school and the Department of Economics expand its faculty in those two areas. So Allan took his undergraduate degree in economics at Harvard. He was then a Rhodes Scholar, where he received a master's in economics at Oxford, and then received his doctorate in economics at MIT. A lot of consistency there, Allan. After receiving his doctorate, he won a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago, followed by a postdoc here at Princeton, before joining our faculty at the start of this academic year. And he is currently teaching a course in the Policy School on economics of climate change. Allan's research focuses in large part on environmental and developmental issues in Southeast Asia, an area of incredible importance both to biodiversity and to social progress. And some of his work, for example, has involved looking at patterns of deforestation in Southeast Asia driven by oil palm cultivation as a lens to understanding when and if international pressure can be used to ensure better environmental performance from a country that won't willingly do so via its domestic legislation. He's also looked at healthcare in Indonesia, asking the question of whether electoral accountability in the wake of democratic reforms is a way to discipline or redirect public spending in more equitable or fair manner. And he's also involved in research on sea level rise and urban adaptation in Indonesia, which will be the topic of his talk today. But it's a real pleasure to welcome you here, Allan.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, David. It's wonderful to be here. It's been wonderful interacting with David in particular and C-PREE, more broadly. So I'm excited to talk. Okay, I'm going to move this over so it's not blocking me. Okay, so I'm excited to talk to you today about new research on sea level rise and what it means for the metropolis of Jakarta. So the starting point is a starting point that we're familiar with, which is that sea levels are rising globally. What I'm showing you here is a figure from this Nichols et al. 2021 paper, which looks at not just absolute levels of sea level rise, but relative levels of sea level rise, accounting for the fact that in certain parts of the world, land subsidence effectively accelerates the extent to which certain places are dealing with these rising seas and these rising oceans. And what I want to point out for you here is this particular part of the world in red that is most severely impacted in terms of relative sea level rise, Southeast Asia. What I'm going to do in this paper is zoom in on the biggest city in Southeast Asia, the city of Jakarta. And so what I'm showing for you here is a picture that I took myself, actually. I think it's a pretty good picture, in Jakarta a year and a half ago, of a mosque that used to be known as Waladuna Mosque. Used to be because as the sea level rose, the city responded by building a seawall, and you can see the seawall on the right there. But you can see that they built the seawall on the inside of the mosque, and in so doing gave the mosque back to the sea, back to nature. I think this is really emblematic of the kinds of issues that Jakarta faces, not just now, but in the years to come. In direct response to this sort of existential threat, not sort of, but truly existential threat to the city, the Indonesian government has responded with massive proposed investment in a seawall, physical infrastructure to protect the city. This, I think, has been at the fore of the policy discussion in Jakarta over the past 10 or so years, and very much is the #1 piece of policy discussion related to climate and climate adaptation in the country. And what I'm showing for you here is the sort of most ambitious version of this enterprise, which is this massive seawall at the top here to protect the city in the shape of the Garuda bird, the national symbol of the nation. So very connected to national identity in many ways. And so that's the motivation for what I'm after today. I'm interested in the sea level rise that threatens 1 billion people by 2050, including about 700 million in low elevation coastal zones today. I'm focused on Jakarta because Jakarta is particularly severely impacted. Jakarta will be 35% below sea level by 2050. And in that sense is living an accelerated version of the kinds of problems that New York, Miami, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Mumbai will all face by the end of the century. But on top of that, Jakarta is important because it's a city of 31 million people. It's the world's second largest city in the world in terms of population and on track by 2030 to overtake Tokyo as the largest metropolis in the world. And so we have these proposed infrastructure investments that we see in Indonesia up to a cost of $40 billion. So the question I'm really after here is how this government intervention affects, complicates, hinders, slows down long-run adaptation, or in other words, how public adaptation affects or crowds out or reduces private efforts to adapt. That's the question that I'm after. So before I kind of go on, let me just say that in economics, usually people just pepper you with questions throughout. So that's totally fine, whether they be clarifying or not. So you should feel free to ask whatever questions you like. I'm going to shoot to go to 1:05 to also reserve 10 minutes just for questions at the end. But that doesn't mean you should hesitate to ask any questions that come up in the meantime. OK. So what am I doing in this particular paper? What I'm going to do is I'm going to build a quantitative, empirical, dynamic spatial model of development at the coast and defense of that coast. And I'm going to leverage this granular spatial data for the city of Jakarta. And so the kind of overarching narrative here is one in which adaptation in the long run requires us to move inland away from the flood-prone coast. But it's not so simple. I'm going to be pointing out a couple of subtleties here. Okay, the primary one being what in economics we call this moral hazard force. That is, if I as a developer know that after I build my building at the coast, if I know that the government is going to come in and save me, then there's nothing preventing me from stepping in and building it in the first place. In particular, if in building the building, I'm pushing the government to react after it gets hit with a flood. Okay, so there's going to be this moral hazard, this offsetting of private efforts to adapt by public efforts to adapt, and public response and public aid that's going to undercut these private incentives to move inland and adapt in the long run. And making all of this worse is persistence in the form of capital that is durable. Once you build those buildings at the coast, they will persist. They will continue to be there for 50, 100 years, and in so doing, further slow down this ability to adapt. People can move inland, but the buildings cannot. Okay, and so the result that I'm going to highlight here is one in which, if it's the case that the government cannot commit not to bailing developers out after they go and concentrate at the coast, then in that case, there's going to be this limited adaptation even in the long run. And so in terms of where this sits within the literature, the key thing that's sort of different about this paper relative to other papers in economics in particular is in endogenizing government intervention, that is, in modeling the reaction of the government to what private entities do. I'm going to introduce this adaptation friction. Okay, and so this is going to be actually something that Kydland and Prescott, in their seminal paper on government commitment in 1977, Prescott being a Nobel Prize winner, of course, a late Nobel Prize winner, just recently, unfortunately, they kind of mentioned building in floodplains and government bailouts as an early example of this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to formalize that in the context of sea level rise and show how it plays out when I think about a model that considers adaptation over time. Okay? I'm also going to draw a bit of a contrast to this fantastic paper by Desmet et al. Klaus Desmet, Esteban Rossi-Hansberg used to be here at Princeton. Michael Oppenheimer, of course, currently here at Princeton, Bob Kopp, and others. And they make the important point that we need to think about how private actors respond to incentives in the sense that if the sea level rises, it's going to be bad to live at the coast, and so people will respond by adapting, by moving inland. Okay? So they highlight this margin of adaptation that gives rise to a more hopeful picture of the future, a mechanism that we hadn't really tacked down before. Now, the direct consequence of that, however, is that they're going to make statements like, in the year 2200, once we allow for this inland migration, the impact on global GDP in real terms, after the sea level rises by a meter, is 0.11% of GDP. And to me, that seems a bit low. Okay? And it seems a bit low because it also implicitly involves the US government, for example, allowing New York City to fall into the ocean. Okay? So what I'm pointing out is that no, the government is going to respond. Given that the government responds, that's going to affect this adaptation over the long run. Okay? It's going to introduce this friction. I'm also going to, in kind of setting up this dynamic spatial model, talk about how I can leverage an insight from economics to kind of simplify the estimation of the dynamics. I'll go into more detail there. And importantly, I'm going to give you quantitative empirical estimates for the city of Jakarta. Okay. So to outline, I'm going to formalize this theory. I'm then going to show how it frames the empirical exercise, and then I'm going to show you some policy simulations. We pause briefly there if there are any questions. Okay, perfect. Crystal clear then. All right. So this is the theory. This is the simplest version of an economic theory of development and defense at the coast. This won't have every single thing you're thinking of, but this, I think, is the most boiled down version that captures exactly the economic mechanism that I'm after. So this is the model. First, we have developers that develop development D at some convex cost C of D. Okay? Building is not free. You have to pay some cost. It goes up the more you build. The government then is going to step in and invest in defense G, G for government, also at some cost. It's not free. Okay? And that cost is going to be E, E for government expenditure, for example. Here I can think about investment in a seawall that it's literally going to protect the city, but the theory is more general than that. It can be investment in subsidized flood insurance, for example, which is also something costly as a government program that helps people at the coast. Okay? But to fix ideas, I'm going to talk about a seawall. Now, given this development and given this defense, development D, defense G, residents then are going to realize some residential value from the development and the defense, okay, R of D comma G. And there's going to be positive complementarity in this residential value. So what do I mean by that? The more protected you are at the coast, the more value there is from building extra buildings because the building's protected. There's no protection, you build an extra building, it's not going to be that valuable for residents. Similarly, the more buildings are there at the coast, the more there is to protect, the greater the value from building a wall to protect those buildings. If there are no buildings there, there's not that much value from building a wall. This positive relationship is going to turn out to be key for this moral hazard mechanism. Okay. So then I can think about social welfare, which I define as follows. It's going to be this residential value, the value of the buildings and the wall, less the cost of building those buildings, less the cost, E, of building that wall. This is what the social planner or the government has in mind to maximize. Now, developers are going to have a different objective function. They're just going to think about their private profits. And their private profits are going to ignore this government expenditure because that's public money, not private money. This is the source of the uninternalized externality. So you see now that E is also E for externality. This is where the market failure happens. This is where the moral hazard, mechanism arises. Okay, and so this is the moral hazard mechanism. If I'm a government and I want to maximize that social welfare W, then I'm going to take my first order conditions with respect to defense and development, both of which, as the government in the first best, in the ideal case, okay, can choose directly. And so the first line is just saying that the government's going to want to develop D up to the point that the marginal benefit, or prime, of that development equals the marginal cost, C prime, of that development. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, and then similarly for defense, we're going to go up to the point that the marginal benefit, R prime, of that defense equals the marginal cost, E prime, of that defense. Okay, so this is what the government does in the ideal world. Now, suppose instead that the government can't directly pick development, and instead it's developers that make this decision. Developers are going to enter up until the point that they kind of eat away all of the profits at the margin, private profits. So they're thinking about pi, the private welfare, not the W, not the public social welfare. Okay, and they're going to go up until the point that those marginal profits hit zero because it's competitive. Okay, and so if you just take that derivative and set it equal to zero, you get this condition here. The government is still going to want to maximize social welfare W, but they can only directly pick their level of defense, the G, the government action. And so they do marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that's the same as what's up there. Okay. And so the point here is that there's this extra term in this world where developers act with private profits in mind that's going to give rise to too much development, too much defense at the coast. Why? Because of that positive complementarity. That positive complementarity causes it to be the case that if there are a lot of buildings, if there are more buildings, the government wants to defend more. So G increases in response to D. There's a bigger wall in response to those buildings being built. That is to say that there's an extra benefit of building the buildings. And so you end up with too much building at the coast. And this is important. Okay? So it's a little counterintuitive. If it's the case that the government doesn't act properly, there's too much protection. No, it's too much protection at the coast, too much continued concentration at the coast, which means too little adaptation inland. Okay? So what is the solution here? The solution is very simple theoretically. The solution is to commit as a government, not to bail out people who should not be bailed out. One way to do this is just to commit to that first best, optimal, ideal G star, okay, the optimal level of defense. If no matter what the government always does G star, then G prime of D is zero. That is, defense does not respond to development. And so there's no moral hazard because developers cannot exploit the government. Because no matter what developers do, the government holds firm. Okay? There's a problem here, though, which is ex post, after the building has been built, the cost of the building is sunk. It's going to be optimal for the government to now save that building, independent of any political bias. Okay, just as the social planer, as someone who is maximizing capital W, social welfare, there's going to be this ex post incentive to step in and save, okay, because the costs are already sunk. Now, there's another way to do this, which is instead of targeting a level of defense, instead to commit to targeting a level of development, either with a tax, taxing development, price regulation, or restricting development with zoning, quantity regulation. You can get to the end goal either way. Here again, however, commitment is necessary. One must commit as a government to actually enforce the tax or the zoning. Okay? And indeed, after the buildings get built, developers are going to want to lobby against you to not enforce. And you see this even in the US, where in Florida there are places where that were not zoned to be built in. People built there, then they lobby the government, and the area gets rezoned. Okay? So a lack of commitment. Similarly, when we talk about the National Flood Insurance Program and its re-rating very recently in kind of NFIP 2.0, in effect removing some of the subsidies of building in kind of at-risk places. It turns out there was bipartisan support, the only bipartisan support I've seen in a while, against this re-rating. Why? Because both Chuck Schumer and Marco Rubio, representing New York and Florida, places with a lot of development in flood-prone places, both of them didn't want the re-rating to happen because it would, in effect, remove these subsidies to build in those places. So lobbying has it be the case that that kind of imposing the tax, or in this case, removing the subsidy, is not so easy. Okay, so again, too much coastal defense means too little long-run adaptation. That is, from the perspective of today, statically, ignoring the past, there's going to be this incentive that very much aligns with our intuition about politics to pursue the short-run gain at some long-run cost. Okay, and that's going to be the source of the problem here. And this, I think, makes it kind of also makes the point somewhat starkly. This is a picture from a government report in Indonesia talking about the policy options facing the city. Okay? 3 options: an offshore seawall, an onshore seawall, and doing nothing. And implicit in this, and explicitly in the text, doing nothing is not an option. Okay? Given the lives that will be lost and the economic value that will be lost, doing nothing is not an option. Given that doing nothing is not an option, the government is going to save everyone who's there today. And so from the perspective of yesterday, if I knew that the government was going to save me, there's nothing stopping me from continuing to build in this place. Okay? And here you actually see the kind of national identity again. Here, this kind of spire is the national monument, the historic city center of Jakarta. And I read from a sociologist's text kind of discussing this. And she talked about how in this picture here, as the floodwaters approach the national spire, the national monument, there's something about the national identity of Indonesia at stake here. Okay? Maybe a little bit hyperbole, but I think this idea that Indonesia is going to act and save because they have to politically is something that's very salient. Okay. And so that's that one period model. In a single period, the developers can exploit the government by pushing the government to over-defend at the coast. Okay? And what I want to claim is that this very simple exercise, it's really the first order conditions and it's just the one extra orange term, that's it. This simple mechanism, when I think about multiple rounds of negotiations and interactions between developers and the government over time, can lead to very rich dynamics and rich predictions. So for example, this moral hazard is going to arise not just within a period, but across periods. It's not only the case that current developers exploit the current government, but current developers also exploit the future governments. Similarly, if you have a government that has what I call a political myopia, that is, they care about the short-run gains, but they don't care about the costs to future administrations, then you can also have that the current government exploits future governments. For the current government, it's good to keep building because they can claim credit for all of these buildings that get built. But then part of the cost of having that continued coastal concentration is that a future government is going to need to deal with the costs. If they don't internalize the costs, that's the uninternalized externality, that's the market failure. And then you have this moral hazard from the perspective of the government, not only from the perspective of the developers. Furthermore, there's going to be this persistence of development where now actually the current government, to the extent that they do care about the future government, to the extent that they do care about the costs to the future government, the current government moves before the future developers that are going to exploit the future government. And so the current government can now help the future government by building a little bit less and therefore lowering the extent to which the future government is locked in. But they'll only do this, the current government will only do this if they care about the future government. Okay, and lastly, there's going to be this real persistence. If I develop a lot today, that's going to push me to develop a lot forever. Because if there's a big stock of existing buildings to save, the government is going to step in and continue to save that stock of buildings. And that's going to make it even more enticing for developers to keep developing. So these are where the dynamics just meaning the over time interactions, start to become interesting in terms of persistence, but also the politics of the problem. Okay. So from there, I'll move now to the empirics, all right? And let me reproduce this equation, this big W, the residential value R of development D and defense G, less the costs of development, C of D, less the costs of defense, E of G. Okay? And this kind of simple theoretical setup is going to set the stage for the entire empirical exercise. So what I want to do is break this residential value into the buildings that are getting built and the flood proneness over space, or in this case, of a particular spot. Okay? And that I can estimate with an economic model of residential demand, where these residents are picking over space, so it's a spatial model, where to live, with flood risk in mind. Okay, so there's going to be this spatial model of residential demand where residents care about flood risk. That's going to give me an entire demand curve, which is it's actually the derivative of this with respect to D. Okay. So that's something about demand. I'm going to have an economic model about demand over space. Where am I going to get this flood risk from? The impacts of defense G, a seawall G, on flooding F. Where am I going to get that? That's not going to be an economic model. That's going to be a scientific engineering model, a hydrological model of flood risk. With that, for a given level of a seawall, for example, I can tell you not just at this coastal neighborhood, how prone is it to flooding, but I can tell you across the entirety of Jakarta, over space, heterogeneously, how does this wall impact flood risk? Okay, so I'm going to have not an economic model, but an engineering model here for F. Okay, there are two more pieces, the cost side. Cost C of D. In economics and in industrial organization, the phrase is often, I'm going to estimate a model of the industry to recover the cost structure of the industry. That is, I can set up a model of supply of this developer industry, and then I can back out from that. I can invert the model. I can estimate the costs that rationalize the kind of building that I saw in the data. And so this is going to be a function that I then estimate with an economic model. And importantly, this is a dynamic model where these developers are not just thinking about today, but they're thinking about the future as well. That's going to give rise to computational complexity that I'm going to need to deal with in the empirics. Okay, so this is an economic model of supply that I'm going to estimate. And then the last bit are these costs E. The costs of building a wall of a given size, of a given height, of a given width, what have you. I'm just going to take those from engineering cost estimates. Okay, so I'm not estimating that. I'm not estimating it myself. Someone estimated them. With these pieces, now I can go from this simple stylized theory into a quantitative model of Jakarta to talk about policy simulations. Before I jump into that, though, this thing is kind of new. I think this is cool. I wanted to find an example historically in Jakarta of the government intervening to reduce flood risk and see if it was the case that developers developed more in response to flood risk going down. That's very natural theoretically, but to what extent did this happen in practice? Before the big seawall, the biggest kind of intervention in terms of infrastructure for flooding in the city was the West Flood Canal. This is Banjir Canal. Canal is canal, and then Banjir is flood. So the West Flood Canal that extended from here in the kind of just below the center of the city. That's the national monument up there, the kind of four-sided figure. And then it comes up here. Okay. Down here in the south is higher elevation than in the north, and the sea is on top of the north. And so floodwaters, river waters flow, and rainwaters flow from south to north. And so this canal, in effect, kind of provides more protection above the canal because water's flowing this way and it drops into the canal. It provides more protection above than below. And so what I can do is go back in the historical data. This is a map from, I believe, 1905. From Dutch colonial times, and I can collect and digitize all of these Dutch historical maps to see the extent to which this flood canal, which was built in 1918, impacted development. Okay, so red is developed. And so I can zoom in around this border, so this is a bit of a spatial regression discontinuity, we call it in economics. It's just zooming in space at a certain point. And you can see that before the canal was built, in 1910, the canal being built in 1918, there's no difference in the amount of red, the amount of development at this border, at this boundary, because there was no canal there at the time. And then after the canal got built in 1945 relative to 1918, this is when the canal was built, and so there's this difference in flood risk, and indeed you can see that there's more development on the side of the canal that is protected. Okay, so an historical example of the government intervening and developers then increasing their concentration in this place that is fundamentally flood prone. I'm going to take this with my model and kind of project out to do policy simulations for the seawall of Jakarta. Okay. I'm going to go just at a high level over the kind of demand and supply models. Okay, the demand model is one of residential choice, residents choosing where to live over space. They live now in an origin tract J. I'm thinking about 300 by 300 meter cells here. Thinking about where to move in terms of their destination K. Okay, and they're going to think about how expensive it is to live in each of these different destinations, so the rents are. They're going to think about the flooding associated with each of these different districts, or kind of neighborhoods rather, or actually parts within a neighborhood, areas within a neighborhood. F, okay. They're going to think about amenities, how nice it is to be near a school, for example. X, some I observe, some I don't observe. Those that I don't observe are the epsilons. Because I don't observe them and they're correlated with things, it's going to give rise to some endogeneity problem that's going to bias my estimation. I'll deal with that in some way. Okay, and then they're also thinking about the migration costs, meaning the distance between where they currently live and where they end up. And so at a high level, what am I doing here? At a high level, the story is that I want to think about the costs of long-run adaptation. That is to say, I want to think about the costs of moving inland over time. There are two costs that show up on the demand side. First off, when I move inland, I'm giving up the nice high amenity places and moving to lower amenity places. I'm giving up those benefits, so that's one cost. The second is I actually have to move, and actually moving is costly. And so I want to estimate these migration costs. Okay? So that's where on the demand side, moving inland is costly. Both of those pieces, what are the nice places and what are the migration costs I'm estimating here. That's the point of demand. There's another place where this shows up, where demand is important rather, which is the extent to which people react to flooding historically is what I'm going to use to infer the benefits of reducing flooding in the future. Okay? If it's the case that people are super sensitive to flooding being a little bit greater or a little bit smaller in the past, 2015 to 2020, that's going to imply that there is a lot of utility loss from flooding. That's then going to imply that if in the future flooding goes down, there's going to be a big utility benefit from reducing that flooding. Okay, so in this sense, I'm reading from the historical relationship what the impacts of reducing flooding with a big seawall will be in the future. There's definitely some extrapolation there. That's all in utility terms. And so how do I think about it in dollar terms? That's going to be based on this coefficient alpha, the extent to which people respond to rents, which is going to tell me how much they value at $1 versus some unit of utility. That's going to allow me to monetize the utility benefit of reducing flooding. Okay? That's the point of demand. So I have data on where people live, and I can estimate demand from that. And then I can show you those estimates. The only thing I want to point out here, so this flooding estimate, for example, I can think about in relation to the rents. And so if I kind of multiply out the units and do a back of the envelope calculation, this sensitivity to flooding implies that at current levels of flooding, residents value that mean level of flooding the damages from that mean level of flooding annually at around $320 million. Okay? That's what these demand estimates imply. That's in line with a Budiono et al. 2015 study that does a more accounting style exercise that finds a cost of 300 million. Okay? If I think about the variation within the data, and I think about a 1 standard deviation increase in flooding, as is totally plausible, 0.25 meters, as is totally plausible within kind of IPCC projections of sea level rise. Now we're talking about an additional $500 million of yearly damages. 2 standard deviations is 1.1 billion, and 4 standard deviations, which is a 1 meter increase, totally within the range of the IPCC estimates. We're talking about 2.2 billion annually. With 10% discounting, that's 22 billion in total. Okay? So this is the kind of magnitude of the damages. Now on the supplier side, there are going to be dynamics here. Okay? And by dynamics, I mean that suppliers are thinking about what's going to happen next period. This kind of thinking about what's going to happen next period is crucial because when you build a seawall, you create safety over time. And so if I only think about the benefits for safety today, I'm going to massively understate the benefits of the wall. At the same time, when I think about the over time, I need to think about a developer thinking about their decision today, but then also how that decision today combines with their decision tomorrow, and how that decision tomorrow combines with the decision in the period after. Okay, and so when you kind of multiply this out over time, it becomes very computationally complicated. Right? And so I'm going to have a way to deal with that technically. Okay, and so what's happening here, and this is a bit simplified relative to the paper, the continuation value, that is the value to the producer, the supplier over time, the present discounted value, if you will, okay, is going to be a function of the rents R that they get from having development D, their development holdings D today. And then they're going to get to decide whether they convert some of their land into a building or not. And they're going to choose the maximum, whether they do it, yes, 1, or don't do it, 0. Okay? So if they do it, then they're going to pay the cost C, minus C, of building that building. But the benefit of that is that they move into the next period with 1 extra building, but they give up their 1 unit of land because they've converted it. If they don't build anything, then we're in this small v 0 category. And then if they've not built anything, then they move into the next period t plus 1 with the same amount of developed buildings and the same amount of land. Okay? All right. At a high level, what am I trying to quantify here? I'm trying to quantify the costs of long-run adaptation in the form of moving inland. When I move inland, on the supply side, what are the costs? I'm going to have to give up the places that are currently high rent, and I'm going to end up moving towards places that are currently lower rent. And then, furthermore, I'm going to have to actually build the new buildings. So I'm going to incur these construction costs. The point of the supply side is to capture both of these two things. I'm going to estimate both of those costs, in addition to having the supply side really speak to the over time relationships that are present here. Okay. As I said before, adding these dynamics gives rise to additional complexity computationally that I'm going to deal with in a sort of technical way. Okay. I won't go into too much detail there. The highest level version of that is that I can look at real estate prices that in theory should capture, in theory, okay, efficient real estate markets, small developers, what have you, that capture the extent to which all of the future profits kind of are important, okay? So if I'm thinking about the future, if the future is a big stream of revenues, and I want to capture that somehow, if the real estate market is efficient, then it should be the case that a big stream of revenues into the future should show up in the real estate price today, because if you buy the building, you're going to have access to that big stream of revenues. And if you're willing to buy this relationship between the real estate prices today and the future value, big V, then estimation is going to be very simple. Okay. And there's a long discussion in the paper about this, but I'll not go into too much detail. Okay, and so the data that I have are the building, I know where buildings are being built, I know those real estate prices, and so I can estimate this model. Okay? For the sake of time, I'm just going to skip this bit. There's also, methodologically, what I'm doing is a little bit different from what people normally do and has certain advantages. And so in the paper, I talk about that. There's a bit of a methodological contribution here as well. Rents being determined in equilibrium such that they clear markets, meaning the rents will adjust, so supply equalizes with demand. On the side of the government, I want to have that hydrological model of flooding. And so I'm going to take a machine learning approach here. In the hydrological literature, there are physical-based, kind of fluid dynamic-based models. That's one approach. Another approach is a machine learning prediction-based approach. Because I actually see flooding in the data, I observe that flooding over a period of 8 years at a monthly and very fine geographic level. I can just do the machine learning thing. And it fits decently well. The government is going to have some level of commitment and some level of political myopia or turnover that I'm going to account for explicitly. And I'm going to tell you if the government can commit, or if it can't commit, this is what will happen. So I have that hydrological model and those engineering estimates. When I talk about, in economics, we call them counterfactuals, really just policy simulations, quantitative policy simulations. This is how everything fits together. Okay? In response to some seawall being built, it's going to impact flooding and flood risk across the entire city of Jakarta in some spatially disaggregated way that I quantify with the machine learning-based hydrological model. Given that flood risk decreases in certain neighborhoods and not others, that's going to change how valuable it is to live in certain places. That is, it's going to change the prices, the rents of living in certain places. What's giving me that? That's the demand model, because the demand model tells me how sensitive people are to flooding. Not just in Jakarta as a whole, but in the individual locations. Lastly, given that the rents are going up or down, how is it that developers respond by, if there's less flooding, and so higher rents, how is it that developers respond? How much more do they build in terms of development? That's going to be given by the supply model. Okay? And so with this, I can trace out how developers respond to a seawall being built. And that's what is going to drive the policy simulations. This is how the pieces of the empirical model fit together. OK. And so in the last, since there were no questions, I'm just going to try. I'm not going to go until 1:05. Let me just go through the policy simulations. Okay? So this is the simplest version of just a single period. And here what I'm plotting for you are the kind of best response functions. Okay? So what does that mean? This is the government here. This is saying the more development there is, the more buildings there are to protect, the more the government is going to want to defend. Okay? And then if the government acts with commitment, then this is how developers respond. Developers are going to respond. It's also upward sloping. Why? Because the more protection there is, the more appealing it will be to developers. So we're going to go up. Okay, and where they cross is the equilibrium. This is where the Nash equilibrium. There's no profitable unilateral deviation. So what's the orange line? The orange line is if the government can't commit, then remember there's this moral hazard term, that extra orange term, which is in effect going to increase the benefit to developing. Why? Because if I develop, not only do I get the extra profits of developing, but I'm also pushing the government to save me more. Okay? And so that's going to, for a given level of defense, it's going to push up how much developers want to develop. And when I open that up like that, we're going to instead end up at this higher equilibrium where there's too much coastal defense and there's too much coastal development, which means that there's slower adaptation inland. If I can commit as a government, then I shut down this orange term. For example, I'm always going to do this G star, then you don't have the problem and you're at the ideal, the first best. Okay. So now what I want to do is show this to you over time. If there's full commitment, okay, then we have this level of development that kind of goes down over time. This is the flow of development. So you're getting less new building at the coast over time. If the government cannot commit, then everything just goes up, okay? Because now developers are counting on the government to save them, and so there's nothing stopping them from developing a lot. What I'm going to do here now is show you development. So this is this line, this solid blue line, and the dotted dark blue line are the same as what I just showed you. Okay, so full commitment, less development, and no commitment, more development. I want to think about limited commitment, which is a government that can commit to a given policy for a short period of time, but after that might get exploited by developers. This is a forward-looking government, okay? So what you see here is kind of what I mentioned before. This forward-looking government is going to defend a little bit under, and that's going to lead to a little bit less development, even compared to this kind of first best, this ideal with full commitment. They're going to go under here. Why are they going under here? It's because if they underdo it here, then they're reducing the moral hazard for this future government. The future government is going to get exploited. Okay? The future government is going to have too much development relative to the ideal. But if the current government didn't help them, then it would be even worse. Here, the current government cares about the future government, so they're happy to sacrifice a little bit during the current administration in order to help the future administration. Now, the political economy is important here because if the current government doesn't care about the future government, then you see they don't underdo it. They don't help. And in fact, they exploit a bit. Okay? And so they're going to overdo it because they can exploit the future government. They're still going to do less than the no commitment case. Why? Because they don't want to be exploited themselves. But they're happy to exploit the future government. Okay, I'm going to skip the defense. The other thing I want to talk about is the extent to which alternative policies can help navigate this political landscape. So for example, if it's the case that one can reduce demand at the coast by moving the political capital of Indonesia somewhere else, which is being done, by subsidizing migration inland, by investing in inland cities to make them more attractive, then what one does is one would reduces the impact of not being able to commit when we're talking about the seawall and the coast. Why? Because if I reduce demand at the coast, I reduce the rents at the coast. If I reduce the rents at the coast, I reduce the benefit to developers of exploiting the government. And in so doing, I reduce the moral hazard. And when I do that, if I reduce the moral hazard, then whether I can commit or not commit, the gap is going to be smaller than in a case where the rents are very high and therefore the moral hazard benefit is really big. Okay? And you see here, in this simulation at least, if I reduce the development at the coast, the demand at the coast, the population at the coast by 25%, then now instead of taking a 78% hit on welfare when I can't commit, I'm now only taking a 22%. Inland subsidies or moving the capital also require a kind of commitment, but they're policies that encourage rather than punish. And so maybe they're easier to navigate politically. Okay? And so that's kind of the takeaway here in terms of policy. The political economy matters. Commitment is super simple in terms of the theoretical solution, but it's not easy in practice. And so what I'm trying to emphasize here is how politics can hinder adaptation if we don't account for them. As I hinted at on the last slide, some policies, for example, those that encourage or those that are indirect rather than direct, they may be more politically feasible. And so what I want to highlight is we should entertain those policies, those inland subsidies, for example, even if they're not quite as effective as the thing that in theory is best, because the thing that in theory is best might not actually work in practice. It may not be feasible. Okay, and then lastly, policy has dynamic effects. There's persistence, so good policy has a persistent effect, even if it's only temporary. At the same time, these administrations over time may interact in ways that also contribute to moral hazard. So with that, let me close this talk today. It was about how there are these major frictions via the government and political economy that can impede adaptation to climate change. Talked about Jakarta, which foreshadows sea level rise over time for many big cities in the near future. And to close, I want to take you back to Waladuna Mosque and show you what's happening on the land that has been converted just inside the seawall given that it's kind of a little bit wet anyway, they adapted by growing new rice fields there. They're growing rice. Okay, new beginnings in Jakarta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allan. We will take questions for Allan. You have them, please put your hand up. And Allan, you want to call the questioners?
Perfect. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. This is great. I'm curious, so I'm mostly familiar with the public finance spatial models, and often they optimize across a bunch of, the government is optimizing, including the tax revenue that's coming from particular locations and being transferred to the areas where you're making these investments. And so I'm curious if you're thinking about incorporating that. And it wasn't super clear to me if it was Jakarta itself that was Jakarta's government that was paying for these investments, or if it was a nationwide investment, and who was paying for it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, these are super important questions. If I were a public finance economist, I would have kind of gone more in that direction. So the short answer is I don't have any of that. I don't have any of the tax revenue. This matters in terms of the uninternalized externalities. So if, for example, you think that a local government has a binding budget constraint, then they can pay for a wall, but in paying for the wall, they need to raise taxes later. And if they raise taxes later in some other form, then there's no free lunch here for developers, and so there's limited value from exploiting the government. There's limited moral hazard. The reason why I think it's reasonable to abstract from that in this setting is, first off, it is the national government that is funding a lot of this wall. That's in this particular case. Suppose that the Indonesian government wasn't funding it. It could have been the World Bank or the IMF. Even if the World Bank or the IMF wasn't there, within Jakarta, the inland neighborhoods are going to need to pay taxes that end up at the coast. And so either whatever level of kind of administration we want to talk about, global down to local, as long as you have this bit where the coastal developers are not fully paying for all of the wall that gets built, then you're going to have this moral hazard problem. Magnitude will be different. That's right. That's right. Please. Yeah, absolutely. Here I'm talking about a seawall really just to fix ideas. The model that I put forth in the theory section is very general in the sense that we could be talking about subsidized flood insurance. We could be talking about kind of investment in mangroves to protect the city. If it's the case that those mangroves increase residential value because they lower flooding, but if it's the case that the IMF is paying for the mangroves, then that's also going to be an uninternalized cost of living at the coast that developers aren't going to internalize. You'll still have the moral hazard. But I totally take your point. It's important for magnitudes, absolutely. Please, go ahead, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. I think of it as being connected to this kind of simulation here. At the level of, I mean, where it connects to the previous point is on financing, for example. Okay, so if you think, and this is something I don't have, if the fact that the government is spending all this money on moving the capital, if that reduces the amount of money available for the seawall, then that can, if that binds, then it's going to cut against. It's going to help mitigate. It won't, get rid of, but it will help mitigate this moral hazard impact. That said, the seawall really qualifies as kind of climate adaptation and climate finance, whatever. They could have gotten money from the IMF if they wanted to. Now, in terms of policy, where I see that kind of dovetailing with this is precisely this. If in moving the capital to Borneo in a way that is easy to commit to, if in doing that they reduce, the Jakarta government has less congestion in Jakarta and less demand in Jakarta, then the interaction is just that in doing this thing that they can commit to, they lower the costs of the damages of this problem that they're not able to commit to. And so they're very complementary policies in that way.
I guess I'm curious about, given like the urgency and limited time to actually, reach a tipping point of pushing people out of the city by 2050.
like, isn't the government locked into this defense? Like, when you talk about over-defense, I guess I'm trying to understand what that looks like, because it feels to me that for 30 million people, they're locked into building the wall.
Yeah, of course.
How does over-defense, do you measure that by a smaller wall, or how would you?
Yeah. So here's how there may be two ways that I think about this. So one, the fact that they're stuck today is consistent with yesterday's commitment problem. Okay, so back in the point when they were not stuck, if they had kind of moved in when it was easier, then they wouldn't end up here today. Okay, so in a sense, the moral hazard applies yesterday rather than today. That's the simplest way to apply the model. There's another way to think about this, which is if it's the case that, yes, they're kind of stuck here today, what I would kind of think about is thinking about this playing out over time. So yes, they're stuck here today, but if it's the case that they're going to deal with 5 meters of sea level rise over the long run horizon by staying there, then it's a question of when the Band-Aid gets ripped off, essentially. And what this moral hazard force is going to do is even if it's the case that in the long run, with or without commitment, one moves inland, what I'm saying is that this moral hazard force that arises without commitment is going to delay that move. And so the end result is the same, but the transition is different. It's going to take much longer. And so that's a bit how I would think about that question as well.
Allan, I'm curious, in a qualitative sense, since it would be very hard to model, do you have a feeling for how people's judgments of the efficacy of the adaptation plays out? In other words, the government can say, we're going to build a wall. But then you can ask yourself, is that wall really going to work?
Yeah,
when
of course.
the storm hits?
Of
Or
course.
are they going to build it for what they say is the 100-year event, but actually it's going to be the 20-year event? Do you have a
absolutely.
feeling for how that may be operating on the minds of developers and residents in this situation?
Yeah, so I have a kind of theoretical answer and an applied kind of empirical answer. The theoretical answer is that indeed is going to cut back the moral hazard impact. So for example, suppose you have, in an extreme case, an ineffective government that can only do G equals 0. They just can't do anything. Okay, if G equals 0, no matter what, then G prime of D is 0, so there's no moral hazard. That's going to be suboptimally low, okay, but there won't be moral hazard. Now, I think that in practice, those constraints are a bit soft because it could be that the IMF is the one that builds the thing anyway. The World Bank, or Norway, actually, is what's happening here. Excuse me, not Norway, the Netherlands comes in and builds it in Jakarta. So I think those are soft constraints. And in that sense, the wall is going to do something. Whether it's 20-year or 100-year, that's a question that can be debated. But the wall is going to be built and it's going to do something. I also have an anecdotal. I wonder if I actually have no, I didn't put it in. Okay. Well, in the paper, appendix A.2, there's a particular instance of this. This is also related to Claire's question as well, which is Jakarta is there, but then we can also think about reclaimed land as being new land that can be built on, where the model that I wrote down applies just really directly. One of those developments is called Pantai Indah Kapuk, number 2. Number 1 is on land. Number 2 is reclaimed. Okay, and it got built. And if you go to the website of the developer for this kind of reclaimed land, immediately on the homepage you see the drawing of what the government is going to do to save the city. So developers kind of thinking about what the government is going to do in an explicit way in the marketing material. Similarly, you go to the government website about the seawall, and they reference the development that's going to happen there as an additional benefit of building this seawall. And so I think that anecdotally really gets at this interdependence, this co-evolution of development in defense in a very direct way, at least in the marketing material. Please.
I was curious to what extent you thought about including non-residential development in the maximum material component, such as like firms and manufacturing. I'm not very familiar with what community production looks like in the area, but to some extent you might have resident development trading off against firm-based development.
That's right. So in the simplest theory model, then we can just think about R not being only residential value, but sort of resident plus firm tenant kind of value, and then it's fine. The question is really an empirical one. And so where this would kick in is if I'm estimating demand just on residential data, then maybe this kind of sensitivity to flooding that I'm using to infer all of the welfare impacts in the future, maybe that's somehow wrong. And maybe there's a bit more nuance there. For now, I'm just leaving it at that because to really pin that down on the sort of commercial tenant side, I would need really good data on where those commercial tenants are. I actually do have that. I mean, the same building data that I have, they do distinguish between residential and commercial. And so in principle, that's not that difficult to do, actually. Yeah. No, that's right. Correct. That's right. Yeah, if firms are super sensitive and people need firms near them, either to go to the restaurant or go to work, then that will matter in a way that right now I'm not fully capturing. Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think it's going to change things qualitatively. That's the only difference. That's the only thing is that maybe it'll go from 0.2 to 0.5, and that's a big increase. But then the direction is But I have the data. No, I agree with that. I agree. Well, I guess the other thing is, so suppose that the World Bank just cares about residential welfare. I capture that. What I'm not capturing is how firms respond. If those are captured by the unobserved amenities, then actually my estimation does have that. But then I need to make the strong statement that when we talk about welfare, it's really residential welfare that I'm talking about. But I kind of think that's what the World Bank, to your point, is talking about as well. And then that's maybe how we would try to square them without doing more work. Yeah, thank you.
We have unfortunately run out of time, although if folks want to try to grab Allan at the podium as we head out. Allan, thank you so much.
Thank you so
really
much.
interesting.
Thank you.